All right, let's get right into it. How on earth do we make sense of everything happening in the world? Global politics. Well, it turns out the experts, they don't just look at the facts. They're actually looking through these different lenses, different theories that completely change what they see. So let's dive in and unpack this.
Just think about something like the Syrian civil war for a second. It's just incredibly complex, right? You've got the government, you've got all these different rebel factions, foreign countries jumping in to back different sides, terrorist groups, a huge refugee crisis. How do you even start to explain that? There's no single easy answer. And that's exactly why we need these frameworks, these theories, to help us sort through the chaos and figure out what's really going on.
Okay, so this quote, it's famous, right? But forget the politics for a second. For what we're talking about today, it hits the nail on the head. It's really all about a simple but huge question. What can we actually know about the world? What are the limits to our knowledge? And maybe most importantly, how do our own assumptions about what we can know, how does that shape the stories we tell about why things happen? So here's what we've got on tap. First, we'll look at the big divide in how we even think about explaining war. Then, we'll jump into a world of power politics. After that, a world built from ideas, followed by a look at unmasking global hierarchies. And we'll wrap up by talking about why any of this actually matters.
All right, so let's get into the first big idea. The biggest split in all of these theories isn't really between realism and liberalism or any of the other isms. Nope. It's something much, much deeper. It's a philosophical question, really. Is the world out there a hard, solid thing that we can measure, like a rock? Or is it more like a story that we're all writing together?
So let's start with that first camp, the ones who see the world as a solid, measurable thing. These are sometimes called positivist theories, and the basic idea is, well, you can study global politics just like a scientist studies physics or biology. There's a real world out there, right? And our job is just to observe it, find the patterns, and come up with laws that can explain why things happen and maybe even predict what's going to happen next.
And inside this scientific camp, you've got two heavyweights, realism and liberalism. Now, what's fascinating is they both agree on the starting point, that there's an objective world to study. But man, do they disagree on what that world looks like. Is it a dog-eat-dog world of constant competition, or is there room for us all to work together?
And this quote from Machiavelli? It's basically the heart and soul of realism. Realists are all about the world as it is, not how we think it should be. They'd say, look, if you want to survive, you have to be brutally honest about power, about self-interest, and about conflict. Forget about idealism. That's how you get crushed.
Okay, this next term is super important. It's the foundation for a lot of these theories. The word is anarchy. Now, when you hear anarchy, you probably think of chaos, right? Riots in the streets. But in IR, it means something very specific. It just means there's no world government. There's no one in charge. There's no global 911 you can call for help. Every country is on its own. And that one simple fact changes everything.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Both realism and liberalism start with this idea of anarchy, but they go in completely opposite directions. For a realist, anarchy means a self-help system. You can only rely on yourself, so you've got to build up your power. Conflict? It's pretty much guaranteed. But a liberal says, hold on. Yeah, there's no world government, but we can manage that. We can build institutions like the UN, create international laws, and use trade to build trust. Think about the war in Ukraine. The realist shakes their head and says, see, I told you so. This is what great powers do. The liberal points to the massive global coalition imposing sanctions and says, but look at the cooperation. This is how we push back.
Okay, so we've talked about the world as this thing we can observe. But now we're going to pivot hard. Because this next set of theories, they completely blow up that whole idea. They don't start by looking at the world. They start by asking, how do we actually create the world?
Yeah, what if all those things we take for granted, like power or what a country's interest is, what if they aren't real in the same way gravity is real? What if they're just ideas? Ideas that we've all collectively agreed on? What if the world isn't something out there for us to find, but something we're all busy making right now?
And boom, that brings us to this killer quote. This is the big aha moment from a scholar named Alexander Wendt. He says that anarchy, well, it is what states make of it. Anarchy itself doesn't mean anything. It could be a brutal kill or be killed world, sure, but it could also be a world of friends and allies. It all comes down to the ideas and identities we share. Being in a self-help world isn't a fact of nature. It's a choice we've made. This whole idea is called social construction, and it's the engine behind this way of thinking. Here's a simple example. The border between the US and Canada. It's huge, but it's basically undefended. Now think about the border between North and South Korea. Why the difference? It's not just about military strength. It's because the US and Canada have a shared idea that they are friends or allies. The US and North Korea have a shared idea that they are enemies. These ideas, these identities, are just as real and powerful as any tank or missile, and they can change.
And then you have post-structuralism, which takes this a step or maybe 10 steps further. It says, hey, it's not just ideas, it's the very language we use that shapes our reality. Just think about the difference between calling someone a terrorist versus a freedom fighter. The words aren't neutral, are they? They're packed with power. And the argument goes that the most powerful people get to define what words mean. They create what's considered truth. So real power isn't just about having the biggest army, it's about getting to write the dictionary for everyone else.
Okay, so our last big group of theories, these are often called critical theories. And their goal isn't just to explain the world, no way. They want to critique it and ultimately to change it. For them, the most important thing about the global system isn't anarchy or ideas, it's about hierarchy, deep, unfair structures of power. Marxists will tell you that hierarchy is all about money, about a global capitalist system. Post-colonial thinkers will say, no, you have to look at the long shadow of empire and racism. So how do these unfair systems stick around? A key idea here comes from a guy named Gramsci, and it's called cultural hegemony. It's a really subtle but super powerful type of control. It's not about ruling with an iron fist. It's about making your way of seeing the world seem so normal, so natural, that it just becomes common sense for everybody. And by doing that, you get people to buy into a system that actually benefits you, the ruler, the most.
So what does that look like in the real world? Well, it's the idea that free market capitalism is just the normal, default way to run an economy. It's the assumption that every country is on this one-way street from undeveloped to developed, and guess who's at the end of the road? The West. These aren't just innocent ideas, they're powerful ways of organizing the world. And it's exactly why a country like China, with its totally different economic model, is seen as such a huge challenge. It's questioning that global common sense.
In building on that, post-colonialism gives us another really powerful lens. A scholar named Edward Said came up with this concept called Orientalism. He basically showed how for centuries, the West built its own identity by creating a fictional version of the East, the Orient. It was portrayed as exotic, mysterious, maybe a little backwards, basically the opposite of the rational West. And this wasn't just in books and paintings. This whole way of thinking about the East was used to justify colonial rule and domination.
Okay, I know that was a lot of theory. So you might be thinking, so what? Who cares? Well, here's why it matters. This stuff isn't just for academics in ivory towers. These ideas have real-world consequences. They directly shape the decisions made by world leaders, decisions that can literally be a matter of life and death. And to really see what I mean, let's just take one single event, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Because depending on which of these theoretical lenses you put on, you get a completely different picture of why it happened and whether it was the right thing to do. So, if you looked at it through a kind of liberal, moralistic lens, like many neoconservatives did, you saw the war as a moral mission, a crusade to free people and spread democracy. But a hard-nosed realist, they would have looked at the very same thing and said, this is a huge strategic blunder. We're getting distracted from our real interests and wasting our power. Then, a post-colonial thinker would step in and say, you're both missing the point. This is just the latest chapter in a long, ugly history of Western empires messing around in the Middle East. See? The same event, but three completely different worlds.
And that's really the key takeaway here. These theories, they're not just passive ways of describing what happened. They're active tools. The lens you pick doesn't just change how you see the world, it changes what you do in the world. And what you do? Well, that helps create the world of tomorrow. So that leaves us with one last question, and this one's for you. The next time you're scrolling through the news, looking at conflicts or trade deals or climate change, which of these lenses are you going to use? Which one best explains the incredibly complex, sometimes messy, but always fascinating world we live in?